Never mind. Right, okay, so personal rule 29, 1640. Let's go on with it. So, can you remind me, what's the kind of the background to this? What caused Parliament, the king to get rid of Parliament?
Because he wanted his money for his foreign policy.
Yeah.
War with, and they wouldn't give him money.
Right.
Part of it.
So part of it is to do with sort of struggles over finance. Can you remember what was the kind of the centre of that focus, the struggle with Parliament? It revolved around a person. Somebody the king liked, Buckingham. So it's all down to the Duke of Buckingham. So if you remember the kind of the story, what happens is that Parliament and the king fall out over Buckingham largely, and then 1628 Buckingham gets murdered after a failed Cadiz expedition when Will of England turned up and they raid a Spanish wine port rather than go killing the Spanish. And then a few years later a guy called John Fenton murdered, in 1628, murdered Buckingham. The nation rejoiced, the king was obviously distraught, Parliament cheered, and so the king forbade anybody, he dissolved Parliament, says I don't want them again, and forbade anyone of calling a Parliament again. Yes? All round Buckingham. Was it a good and peaceful time for England? Was it a time of continental tyranny, dictatorship? Do you understand what those terms mean? If you're a tyrant, you're a dictator. But normally people, when one person runs the country by themselves, and normally people would see that as a bad thing, when one person runs it all by themselves. But why continental? Because of course that was how most of the monarchs on the continent were running themselves. France, Spain particularly. Yep. Okay, well, so 11 years without Parliament wasn't entirely unusual. Both James and Elizabeth had done it, and they called Parliament, but most people call Parliament regularly. What was the main purpose of Parliament, really, up to this point? To give money, to grant extraordinary taxation. The king had ordinary forms of taxation and customs and sort of mostly customs fees, that is known as tonnage and poundage, is what it's called. But mostly that was the king's main source of income. If they needed more money for a war or a time of crisis, then they could go to Parliament, who were the representatives of the people, and say, I'd like some more money, please. And Parliament, on the whole, well, in fact, pretty much every time would say, yes, of course you can. But Charles, of course, no longer has that. He needs to get new sources of income. Law was making unpopular changes to the church. England was trying to keep out of the wars. There was an anti-court consensus. We'll go through these. There was a fear of Catholicism and despotism. And Charles was not very well able to communicate with people as Elizabeth and James had done. Religion was dominated by William Laud. Who was William Laud? Well, Abbot Archbishop of Canterbury was the person who Charles inherited as his Archbishop of Canterbury, but he did not favour divine right of kings, which means Charles never really liked him. Laud becomes Archbishop of Canterbury 1633, wants to bring in high church practices. What's high church practices?
Ceremonies.
Yep, ceremonies, sort of statues, ceremonies, the beauty of holiness, he called it. It didn't like the gentry. These people, Renovili, Montague of Chichester, hated for being Laudian bishops. People wouldn't like them. So, Laudian ideas. What did William Laud want? This guy is our Archbishop of Canterbury. The beauty of holiness. What does that mean?
Making churches pretty.
Yeah, make churches pretty. If something's pretty, people will want to go there and it will reflect the holiness of God. A very kind of medieval view, really. You know, if it's a pretty place, people will be filled with awe and wonder and want to worship God, rather than having a plain Protestant church. He wanted ceremonies. He saw the position of the altar as central, altar rather than a communion table, which is what you'd call it in a Protestant church. I don't mean central as in the middle of the church. He wanted it right at the top. Very central location. And he wanted to increase the power of church and society and politics. And this, of course, is very medieval. Who was the last time when the church had had real political power was under who? You know now. Yes, under Henry VIII. Name him. Who was Henry VIII's chief minister?
Cromwell.
Of the one before him. Yeah, Wolsey, Cardinal Wolsey. So, he wanted to make sure the clergy were educated, he wanted to raise the status of the clergy, There we go. Also communion table before and after. Here we go. Pre-Lord, William Laud, of course, becomes Archbishop of Canterbury 1633, wants to, here we go, this is the pre-Laudian, the communion table would be in the middle, and people were, because they wanted to show that the kind of the Christ, when they were talking about Jesus would be amongst the people. Obviously he's not on the communion table itself, but when they did, the purpose of that was to place things for communion ceremony, which is very much a central part of Christian teaching. And so having that there would be that, it's kind of showing that it's the people who are doing it, rather when the Lord did it, he wanted it up here, railed off, to show and emphasise the superiority of the minister. You all right? Laud was a reformer. To the Puritans he was too Catholic. To the gentry he was a low birth, he was a son of a clothier. And therefore, because he wasn't a gentry, what's he not got much respect for? Gentry. He's got no respect for society. I mean, actually, we look at the guy today and we think he's almost a bit of a social reformer. But in a sense of he doesn't see society so stratified. Actually, what I think he's trying to do is build up his own power base by raising up the clergy, because they're the guys who really kind of give him his power base. If he could promote the clergy to make them more powerful. No respect for rank, seen as undermining both religion and the social structure of England. And like divine right of kings. What else do we know about Laud? This guy became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. Well, colourful churches, clean vestments. What's a vestment? Yeah, that's what you wear. In fact, he liked ceremonies, didn't like spontaneous teaching. And he was so, I don't know, to the Catholics he seemed so Catholic that actually, remember 1634, he's offered the position of cardinal by the Catholic Church. So, I mean, in equivalent terms, it's been like offered the position of chief demon in hell to the Protestants at the time. What was his response? Not at the moment. Yes, no, not with Rome as it is. Which kind of leaves the door open as to say, no, hang on a second, if the Roman Catholic Church was willing to change, maybe I'd be willing to do that. And that was really quite extraordinary. What is that evidence of? Roman Catholic conspiracy, well done. So I worried a lot of Puritans didn't give an absolute no. Previously the gentry had often ordered their priests around. They could choose their member of their church. If you're a gentry, one of those middle orders of society, you could choose your minister. He didn't like that. He wanted the clergy to be equal with the gentry. But the problem is he didn't persuade. He was not compromising. He just did it. Well, what else did he do? Hang on. Hello.
Hello, right?
Yes.
Didn't realise it was Tuesday.
Yes.
Fire alarm's going to ring in a minute, just ignore it.
Okay.
Alright? You recording this?
Yes.
Whoops.
That's right.
Sorry about
It's going on YouTube, hope you don't mind.
Oh, don't put it on the alarms go off.
Oh, that's it. Emmett. So, right, okay, other evidence of a Roman Catholic conspiracy. What's going on?
His wife.
Burton, Bastwick and Prynne. What can you remember about Burton, Bastwick and Prynne?
They were anti-Lord.
Ooh, go for it. One of you. Anybody. Becky.
They got their ears chopped off, but they were gentry, so it was seen as like very disrespectful.
Yes. Why did they get their ears cut off?
They wrote anti-Lord pamphlets.
They wrote anti-Laudian pamphlets. They did a few things actually, but in this case, the main reason, 1637, these guys wrote anti-Laudian pamphlets, and therefore were punished with libel, and therefore were punished with having their ears clipped. Yeah. Libel is where you write things about someone which are untrue.
That's a crime.
Yes. Yes, they're a crime now. So yeah, but there's yeah. So if you were to put something in writing which you know is untrue, so newspapers today, they're often done for libel, where they write something that turns out to be untrue. Okay. So that their ears clipped and their faces branded. A very, very unpleasant crime. Put in the pillory. That's a pillory where people lob stuff at you. But actually, it didn't it didn't lead Back in prison. Embarrassed, actually, it stirred up more hatred against Laud, and therefore people were. It drove out more outcry against William Laud and his reforms. Okay, what else about William Laud during the personal rule gives us kind of stokes things up? This building here. The Star Chamber, well remembered. So what is it? What is the Star Chamber? Can you remember?
It's like the church's court.
It's not the church's court.
King's court.
It's the King's Court. So William Laud is actually trying to build up his own political power as well. He gets William Juxon appointed as Crown Treasurer. The last time we had a kind of a senior member of clergy in that kind of senior financial role, Cardinal Wolsey. Yeah. Laud sat on every royal and church court, including the Star Chamber. Can you remember the name of the church courts? High Commission. So he's sitting on these, and he's using them as his own personal law court, and he's using them to punish his enemies, people like Basilisk and Prynne. Church is seen as taking over government, so it's just a real rise to the Puritan England at the time. It's not that the church was just the church was also creeping into society, and that wouldn't be such a problem except that the church, of course, was seeming quite Catholic. You with me? So it's not just a Roman Catholic takeover of the church, it's a Roman Catholic takeover of the whole of society. That's really stoking people up to go and challenge the king. Except, of course, you haven't got a parliament to do so. Well, can you remember, what other change does Laud bring in? It's really stoking up Puritans, bringing about this Roman Catholic conspiracy, feeding it. Book of Sports, someone says it. Yeah, to Puritans all you should do on a Sunday is go to church, do holy stuff, read your Bible. And he said, no, on Sundays is a good time for sports. So 1633 indeed brings out his Book of Sports, says, no, go and do some things. Be sporty, be active on a Sunday. Stoking up the Puritans, making them really think that he's trying to make the church more Catholic, feeding this Roman Catholic conspiracy. What else? He also starts clamping down on the Puritans. So he's not just kind of promoting Laudianism, he's stamping on the Puritans. Actually, there were too many theology graduates going around. And so because they don't have churches, they would go around and give lectures across the country. And to give a lecture, to give a sermon as a church, as a minister, you needed a license. You had to be licensed. Parishes would pay for these Puritan theology graduates to go and give a sermon. They were called lecturers. Laud removed their licenses. So not only is he promoting Laudianism, and is he getting Laudianism into key points in the government, he's actually squeezing down the Puritans. It's a direct attack on the Puritans. Birds of Basilisk and Prynne is cut off. Lecturers had their licenses removed. He's tried to attack it. He called them the ratsbane of lecturing. Ratsbane being a poison. Okay, so religion during the personal rule stoking up this kind of Roman Catholic conspiracy, but people at this time can't do anything much about it. Why can't they do anything about the hatred of his religious reforms? They don't have money. No parliament. That's key. There is no parliament. So the only way that you could counter it is to write, and that's how people, of course, did argue their opinions about it. But of course, who did do writing? Who wrote about their hatred of the religious reforms? Bertram, Basilisk and Prynne in 1637, and they had their ears cut off. Continental tyranny. Anyway, of course, Charles hasn't got Parliament during the personal rule. He's got rid of them for 11 years. What's the main purpose of Parliament? Money. Okay, can you therefore remember some of the king's financial strategies? What did he do to get money during this personal rule? Stoking up hatred. Go on. Ship tax. Forest fines. Distraint of knighthoods. Nuisances.
Boundary. Like the city walls.
The city walls, that's nuisances.
Custom.
Monopolies, customs farmers. Let's quickly whiz through a few of them. Charles does not have permission to collect his everyday taxes, so his tonnage and poundage. Remember, he should have been given, on the first time he called Parliament when he became king in 1625, he should have been given the right to collect taxes for his entire reign. They never gave him that. So he's got to get money from other sources. Ends all wars. When he became king, who was he at war with? Spain and France. Ends war with both of them, 1630, 1631. Treaty of Suza with Spain in 1630 was where he ends war with Spain. Any method he could to get money. Revived old laws, annoyed peopling to the max. Yes, what we got here? So forest fines. Forest boundaries were declared from the reign of Edward III, 1377. Of course, the forests were much bigger then. We shall have a brief moment of break during the fire alarm. Okay, fire alarm ended. Forest boundaries declared from the end of 1377. Forest boundaries much bigger, but of course over time, a bit of with woodland clearing, people burning, using the wood, it's gone down. Anyone who built a house had to pay a fine if it was considered royal forest, and of course lots of people have built their houses where there used to be royal forest and therefore got fined. Bonus marks if you can tell who got fined the most.
Duke of Windsor.
Earl of Essex. Yeah, half of Essex was declared to be forest. Actually, Earl of Salisbury was fined £20,000. Nuisances. What was nuisances? Largely the same sort of thing, really. People were fined for building cities outside, building houses rather, outside cities' walls. But of course, population expansion filled up many of the towns and cities with their old medieval walls, and people had to build their houses around the outside. Now, some people would have done so as a tax dodge. In this case, though, people were building their houses there because there was no space inside, and therefore they were fined. Moving on. Distraint of knighthoods. Can you remember this one?
So you had to pay £30 if you wanted the knighthood, but then £30 if you refused the knighthood as well.
Exactly right. If they felt that you didn't have a title but you had enough money to buy one, you would be offered one. A knighthood would be you could become a knight for £30, and of course many people took them up on this offer. James had sold them. Yeah. However, many refused to buy them. They saw them as worthless. If I've got to buy this, it's worth nothing, and therefore people started turning down the knighthoods. And it's the turning down of knighthood which is called the distraint, the turning down of knighthoods. And of course, the punishment if you did that was against the law, 30 quid. What else? Monopolies. Sorry. Oh yes. Yeah, I'd certainly say so. I mean, you're talking I would say that's a good annual wage for a gentleman. So, I don't know, £100,000 now? What's a good wage for a fairly wealthy gentleman for a year, or woman? Monopolies. Have the right to be the only one to create a particular item. Playing cards was a good one, wines particularly, or something. But anyway, monopolies were sold off by Charles until 1634. There was a kind of great soap test where somebody proved that the soap that the monopolies were making, this person who was the only person allowed to make and sell, that's the key thing, soap. You can make your own soap for your own personal use, but you can make it and sell it on. Only monopoly soap could be sold across the country, and some proved that monopoly soap was bad. In fact, they could make it less. The first consumer test on record, I believe. What else? Ireland. London was fined for failing to promote the plantation of Ulster over the last 100 years. Customs farmers bought the right to collect taxes. Do you remember customs farmers? You know, you could look at a particular county, let's say Dorset, and you say, right, Dorset should pay the king £6,000 worth of tax in a year, and you might sell off the right to tax Dorset for £4,000. You get the cash in advance, and then the customs farmer would go around and try and recoup their money by collecting the taxes in. Yeah? Court of Wards, another one. This is where these, if you died under the age of 21, leaving a young male heir, or whoever your heir is was under the age of adulthood, the Court of Wards would sell off the right to be the warden, or to take care of this young person. In reality, if you were the ward, if you were the warden of this young person, you would kind of take as much as you can from their estate until they reached the age of consent. Earned a lot of money during this period. ship tax, big one. The biggest one, really. The Crown could collect money off coastal counties if they believed it to be a time of danger to make ships. So what do we know about this?
Started off using like making coastal.
Yes.
But then eventually did the whole country.
Yeah. Charles, 1634, Charles collects it off the coastal towns, does spend some of it on ships. 1635, he applies it to the whole country. Do people pay it? To start off with, they did. To start off with, they did. I mean, and if you remember, there's a good case study of Norfolk, which was supposed to pay about just £7,000. And it starts off paying it, but then quickly, within a few years, by 1640, has dropped down, and they're only paying about £1,600. So £190,000 in the first year, most of which was spent on the navy, but it was hated, and it was permanent until 1640, because of course in 1640, Parliament comes back. Applies to all counties, the navy protected the Spanish. Nearly everyone paid it, certainly to start off with, but some people refused. So it starts on 1634, 1635 the whole country. There was a very famous case though. John Hampden, 1637. John Hampden, of course, was previously an MP, in fact became an MP later on. He said, it is not an emergency. There is not an emergency, therefore I should not pay ship tax. And it went to court, and 7 out of 12 Crown judges said you are guilty, which means 5 out of the 12 Crown judges said he was innocent. The King's judges turning against him. Anyway, he paid. Ship tax became harder to collect as the years passed by. Right. Here's this chap. Well, he's Portland. He was the guy who eventually took on the role of Crown Treasurer. Crown debt stood at £1 million at the start of personal rule. Did it go up or did it go down? People muttering at me, it didn't move, it didn't change, it stayed at £1 million. He couldn't afford to go to war, but actually, and no one would lend him money, but Crown debt did not go down, and in fact, income increased by 25% because of all the financial wrangling. And so, on to the end of the... Okay. So that's kind of the major causes of tension. So all those things stirred together and created an awful lot of tension. What therefore brought the personal rule to an end? Can you remember? So let's do the Scottish and the Arabic. So, moving on, why did personal rule come to an end? Was it continental dictatorship? Was it, some sort of a peaceful time? Well, it all comes down to the last bit, the downfall of personal rule. So, backtracking, so Charles cannot afford a war, but something happens to cause that, and you've already got an idea. So, in summary, events in Scotland and Ireland, caused by Charles and Law's bad judgments, which needed an army to fix, which requires money to pay, and of course...
I think your battery's low on your camera, it's flashing.
Is it?
Yeah, it's so might just go.
Oh yeah. Okay, new battery. So, downfall of personal rule, why did it fall down? Events in Scotland and Ireland caused by Charles and Lord, which requires an army to fix, which requires money to pay, and the only way you can get that sort of money is from Parliament, and that of course is why the personal rule failed. So, now there is a history. There is a history here between Charles and Scotland, and a little bit of history goes back to 1625, when in 1625 Charles recalled all church land that had been given away before 1625. So when, like in England, when the Scottish Crown had dissolved the monasteries as part of the Scottish Reformation, they sold off or gave away church land to their followers. 1625, Charles recalled it. He said, I'm going to reverse that, I'd like it all back please, and I'm not going to pay you anything for it. Why would he do that? because potentially, maybe, just maybe, he wanted it back to be able to give it back to the church to remake the church a Catholic church again. Anyway, that's what the rumours were. There's probably no evidence in that at all, no truth in that rather. But Lord the guy kicks it all off. Lord wants a common church, a uniform church in England and Scotland. So what does he do? 1634, that should be, a new prayer book is launched in England, and of course the English do not like it. Why do they not like it? What's it full of? What's the word beginning with C? Ceremonies. It's full of ceremonies. But the problem is that Lord doesn't just want ceremonies, he wants it in every single church. The same. So he doesn't just want it in England, of course, as Archbishop of Canterbury, he's also in charge of the church in Scotland. And so in 1637, well, before 1637, is new Scottish prayer book. 1636 he brings in new canons. What's a canon? It's a church rule. Charles gets crowned to a Laudian ceremony in Scotland when he is actually crowned. 1637, the new prayer book is introduced to Scotland. It has begun, and the downfall is now going to happen. Here we go. The Lord has come amongst us. Oh, whatever. So yes, St Giles' Cathedral in Edinburgh, 1637, the first time it's read out. Of course you end up with this comedy situation with people hurling prayer stools and cushions and Bibles and things down the church towards the deans. He's trying to read from this the first time, leading to all sorts of problems. Bishops, my favourite one of the bishops who starts off his services with a couple of loaded pistols, places them on the pulpit. Let us begin. Anyway, what's the consequence? The Scottish form something called the Scottish National Covenant. They start signing this document saying we reject the canons, we reject the prayer books, we reject bishops. And what's a church system without bishops? Presbyterianism. And all over Scotland people sign this. It's almost like a document of I am Scottish and I'm proud of it. And this goes on. Charles sees this as open opposition, a declaration of war. He pretends to care. Oh, Scottish, I am interested in what you say, but actually in the background, of course, he's getting himself an army together. Scotland, what do? They form something called the Scottish National Assembly. They formally ban bishops. They formally ban the High Commission, the church court rather, in Scotland, and gets itself an army together, which is a problem because, of course, Scotland has lots of soldiers who had been mercenaries in the 30 Years' War, this kind of continental war which had been waging in Europe, mostly in where we now consider Germany. So, the English army. Can you remember what we know about the English army? Any good? No. It relied entirely on the militia system. Sorry? Yeah. Okay. Charles calls for militia. Yeah. The militias were trained locally. They were funded locally. He was supposed to be your local member of the gentry. He was supposed to fund it. He was supposed to get a muster master, a muster master to train these people. But the gentry, of course, didn't want to pay for that. Often they took on the title of muster master themselves, and consequently didn't do a very good job. They liked the title. So, for example, in some places, because of shortness of cash, they would do dry firing, where you'd pretend to fire a gun, but you didn't actually use gunpowder or shot. The muster masters were poor, the gentry liked it because of status, so the English army was untrained, and many of them were poor soldiers. They didn't like leaving the areas, they were Protestants, they agreed with the Scots. Sorry? Not until the First Civil War. Localism, but yes, it's the same idea. Yes, you're right. I mean, that's the same sort of feeling which comes through. That these guys, they're told to go to Scotland, they face off each other in Berwick-upon-Tweed. And so what happens is that the English arrive there, they face against their Scottish, trained, professional soldiers. They don't want to fight. Charles has got a pitiful £185,000 for his army. It's not enough. And then, with the English soldiers staring at their Scottish counterpoints, who they agree with on the other side of the river, the English commander turns up, the Earl of Arundel, and what does he turn up in? A borrowed papal carriage. He wasn't any good, he'd never won anything. The Pope the bell. I mean, it wasn't something the Pope had used, it was for the papal sort of ambassadors in court. and therefore, you know, you might as well turn up with "I love the Pope" on the side. Charles realises he's not going to win, and therefore signs the Treaty of Berwick. Strafford, in control of Ireland, was called. He recommends the calling of Parliament. Actually, Charles doesn't want to call Parliament, and so he asks the City of London merchants for a loan of 100,000. They say, no, we'll give you 10,000. We're not going to loan you 100. Charles has to call Parliament. So he signs the Treaty of Berwick with the Scots. He calls Parliament for money to rearrange and get another army. What happens when he calls Parliament?
19 constitutions?
No, not for a little while. It's called the Short Parliament. April to May 1640 is actually 3 weeks long. And what happens? Parliament don't want to fight the Protestants. They hate Laud. And so they want to settle grievances before giving cash. They don't want Charles's advisors in control. They don't like Strafford, and so they say, Your Majesty, before we give you the money, we have got a few of these grievances, a few complaints that we'd like to discuss with you. Charles, outraged, gets rid of it within 3 weeks. Laud, in the middle of it all, rather helpfully brings out new canons, new church laws saying, you must obey your king. In rather angry shouting scenes, Charles doesn't haggle, he dissolves it after 3 weeks and just hardens people's attitudes towards him. This king is really all about money. And so it moves on. Charles confiscates £30,000 from the City of London merchants. Is that going to be much for a second army? No, you need about 500,000. What happens? Strafford says to the king, Your Majesty, why don't you use an Irish army? The Irish army, even before the Irish army leave Ireland, this Irish Catholic army, the Scots don't wait around to be invaded. They go into England, they get down as far as Newcastle, they seize the vital coal supplies of the north of England. Charles has no choice. Of course, he has to sign a treaty. Can you remember the name of the treaty for the end of the Second Business War? Treaty of Ripon. So, Strafford advised the king to use his Irish army, and so the king signs the Treaty of Ripon. October 1640, the Scots were going to be given £850 a day to cover the cost of occupying Newcastle. Charles is humiliated, Charles is broke, he can't afford the money. What does he have to do now? Call Parliament, and this time he's got no get out, he has to call Parliament, and they have to be around. And of course, what is the name of the Parliament that he calls? The Long Parliament. Which leads us on very nicely to the Long Parliament. So we're still staying with key question 1. We're still staying with key question 1. Why within 2 years of the collapse of personal rule did the Civil War break out? So, we've got lots of tension building up here. Charles is now in a position where he's got Parliament and he can't do anything with them. So where's it going? The voting had the highest turnout of voters till the 19th century. Can you remember, what sort of people did they say we would vote for?
40. No.
Yeah, oh, come on. No, those are the people who are supposed to be able to vote. 40 shilling. Close enough. 40 shilling freeholders they're supposed to be. They're supposed to own quite a sizable chunk of land. It's actually only about 5% of the male population of England who can vote. Anyway, they said, look, we will choose no court papers, no ship money sheriff. Anybody who'd promoted the king's religious reforms, then they, of course, should not be voted as an MP. Anybody who'd collected ship tax or supported ship tax should not be voted. That means that the Parliament that was created as part of the Long Parliament was much more opposed to the king than it had previously been. Much more. So anybody who supported the king in the 1630s is defeated. And then of course you've got the formation of this anti-court consensus. What's the anti-court consensus? Take the words. Anti. Court. The things, the court being the king. Anything all the king's policies consensus? Agreement. Anti-court consensus is an agreement amongst the majority of MPs that they opposed the things that the king had been doing. They were against the king's policies. They had an agreement and were against the king's policies. And it was this anti-court consensus which actually led to all these policies. They wanted to get rid of any hint of Catholicism, this fear of a Roman Catholic conspiracy, and they wanted to get rid of the king's evil advisors, Portland, Finch, Windibank, Lords, Strafford. Restore the constitutional balance, make sure that that the king wasn't overly powerful. Ban all sources of finance of the personal rule. I mean, essentially they had two fundamental fears. They had a fundamental fear of a Roman Catholic takeover and a fundamental fear of the king becoming a dictator. Two fundamental fears. And everything that they did was to kind of counter those two fears. But the problem is, by countering those two fears, they just clashed with the king's personality, and that of course led to civil war. Banned the king's prerogative cords, but they agreed on what they disliked, not on what they really wanted to replace it with. So, Roman Catholic conspiracy. Was there any evidence for a Roman Catholic conspiracy? Yes. Henrietta Maria, his wife. The growth of Roman Catholics in court. Portland, Finch, Windibank. Lord's policies. So there's plenty of evidence for it. Belief that Charles was under the influence of various evil Catholics. Apologies to whichever cardinal that is, just borrowed his picture. And they also feared Strafford's ruthlessness in Ireland. They knew Strafford was a bully boy. They had a policy of thorough. Right. First session, so they go for the evil advisors. 3rd of November 1640, they go straight for his advisors. What happens? Finch and Windibank flee abroad and they don't come back again. What happens to Lord? He's put in the Tower of London and eventually executed right at the end of the First Civil War, 1646. Parliament then focuses on Strafford. There's Lord. Hi. So, what do they do with Strafford? Real name Thomas Wentworth. What do we know about him? He was an MP. Actually, he'd started off opposing the king right at the start of Charles's rule, but had actually changed sides. So he was a big supporter in the 1630s till eventually he'd become Lord Deputy of Ireland in 1633, and he'd run Ireland with an iron fist. So, 11th of November. Parliament try and impeach him. Can you remember what impeaching means?
You try them.
Yeah, you try them. To be impeached is a trial in the House of Parliament. But there's too little evidence against him. To impeach him is to try him on account of treason. There's no evidence that he's committed treason though. So, John Pym, this leading member of Parliament who starts to burn, resorts to an Act of Attainder. What's an Act of Attainder? That's it. It's a parliamentary act. That's all it says. It says there is suspicion of evidence of treason. You don't actually need evidence, you just need suspicion, but you do need to be signed by the House of Commons, the House of Lords and the King. Would the King ever sign such a thing? He did, then, of course. Why? The London mob forces the House of Lords to sign it. Charles starts off refusing to sign it. What changes his mind? Strafford actually writes to him and says, Your Majesty, just sign it, you'll be better off if I do. So Charles signs it, afraid of a popular uprising, and so 12th of May 1641 takes a good year. He is eventually executed. Off with his head. And so Parliament, having now got rid of his evil advisors, then targets all his methods of being a dictator, all his law courts, all the machinery, as they call it, personally, anything which allows him to run a government without Parliament. And remember, government is actually whoever's running the country. These days, if we think about government, we think Parliament. Back then, of course, government, of course, is the King and his advisors. So who do they ban? What do they get rid of? Star Chamber, High Commission. Yes, off they go. Star Chamber, High Commission, both abolished. The personal law courts. Ship money declared illegal. Forest boundaries changed to 1625 from 1377, so people could stop being fined. Strait of Light is illegal. Court of Wards was abolished. And then Parliament starts getting a little bit more drastic. I think this, to me, this is the bit where they start waking up and realise they can keep pushing the king. And they start bringing in new radical policies to make sure the king cannot become a dictator. What do they bring in? The first really radical document. Not yet. Triennial Acts is the first one. May 1641, this Triennial Act, it says that Parliament should be called at least every 3 years. And they also added with this something called the Act of Perpetual Parliaments, which says that only Parliament can approve of their own dismissal. No longer the King's prerogative. That word prerogative?
Wishes, like rights.
Yes, his rights, his natural rights. It is now Parliament's prerogative to call it, to dismiss themselves. Very radical. Charles could no longer call and dismiss parliaments at will. Why did he sign this radical document? Was it because he was so upset about Strafford? Was it because of pressure from the mob? Was it because he just saw it as a temporary thing? Oh, once I've defeated the Scots, I won't need Parliament anymore, I'll get rid of Parliament and I won't call them again. Who's going to stop me? What else? So John Pym is now emerges as our leading MP. Keeps reminding people of a Roman Catholic conspiracy. Henry Vane, Oliver St John. He kept worrying people about an armoured plot and an attempted coup d'etat. This is his kind of fear that the king wanted to become a dictator and would do so by overthrowing Parliament. So, anyway, it almost looks like it could sort itself out, and then this gentleman died. Can you remember who the Duke of Bedford was?
Was he the foot in both camps?
Yes, he had a foot in both camps. So it always happened sort of May 1641ish. He dies. He was actually a king of both, a friend of both king and parliament. He was a courtier, so the king liked him. He was also the member of the nobility who was really in charge of. John Pym John Pym's constituency was actually Duke of Bedford's land, so really Duke of Bedford was very much responsible for choosing John Pym or having influence of him becoming an MP. So he was lost, and he had almost managed to persuade the king to have leading members of Parliament as his chief advisors. Almost. People like John Pym was going to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. But then he died, and so the king backtracked. So Parliament was almost on the verge of having members of Parliament as the king's chief advisors. So what did Parliament go on to next? It follows. They almost had had control of it. What's that? So that is what leads to the 10 propositions. Because Bedford has died, Parliament now thinks, right, we want to have the people we trust as the king's advisors. And so that's the 10 propositions. The main one being that Parliament would be able to approve the king's advisors, and if it doesn't like them, it'd be able to fire them. Taking away the king's prerogative again. Does the king accept the 10 propositions? No. One of the 10 propositions was the king should accept these before he leaves for Scotland in the summer. And the king goes, whatever, and goes off to Scotland. The king doesn't accept these at all. But it shows how desperate or how confident Parliament are getting. Also at the same time, we've got the root and branch petition. Do you remember this one? Yeah. John Pym's suggestion, part of this kind of evidence that they're trying to tackle the Roman Catholic conspiracy. They want to abolish bishops, but most MPs, they just want to get rid of Laudian bishops, not get rid of all bishops, not have a Presbyterian system brought in. Pym knows he would lose, gives it to a committee to discuss. I like that. Good old political way out. And so, end of the first session of Long Parliament. End of the first session. Most MPs are happy with the progress made. Yeah, there's cracks appearing in the anti-court consensus. Never mind. Anti-court consensus feel they've met their aims. There is still a fear of the Roman Catholic conspiracy, but there's also fear over Pym's use of the mob. Pym knows that cracks are appearing. He wants to keep Parliament negative, but either which way, the king goes off to Scotland in August 1641, hoping to ratify and to approve his treaty with the Scots. MPs were concerned that Charles would go there to raise an army. In fact, there is a little bit of evidence. A guy called the Marquis of Montrose does briefly grab some of these covenanters, these people who signed the Scottish National Covenanters, reminded people of an army plot that, generally speaking, the anti-core consensus felt it had made good progress. Consequently, it looks like nobody at this point is talking of civil war, but this is in August 1641. Okay, going on with it then. So how come it goes from a situation where no one's talking of civil war in the August of 1641 to really, by a year later, the country gets civil war? Well, that's the second session of non-parliament. And we'll just go through this before we have a quick break. So, what happens? All in the background, Charles has his voice nagging at him. And who's that voice? His wife, Henrietta Maria, who's saying to him, Charles, you must be a king. Stand up yourself. You shouldn't be listening to this parliament. And so she's forever, really, forever saying kind of sort of, you shouldn't kind of listen to this parliament, stand up against them. Pym, when they meet again, Pym is convinced that Charles should not be trusted, worried that the king would go back to his absolutist tendencies.
Oh, he released the document, didn't he?
Yes, he does, very shortly, well done. But yeah, so Pym is fearing that the king still wants to become a dictator. Henrietta Maria is a dangerous influence, and she's saying, do not listen to Parliament. She just didn't understand that England was a much more balanced constitution than France was, the country of her birth. Anyway. So, actually, during this time, there is a growing support of the king. Why does civil war not look certain? Because there's a growing support of the king. These guys are called constitutional royalists. Who are they? People like Edward Hyde and Viscount Culpeper. See what I did there? Anyway, these guys grow in their support of the king, this emergence of a king's party. Now, these people had opposed the king's policies in the 1630s, but they're now coming to support the king again. And the belief that actually the balance of the constitution was now fully in place. And so, of course, and there's also a kind of big fear of kind of the mob that support Charles. There was concern about the extremist Puritans destroying the Church of England and society. They were worried that Pym would cause anarchy, and consequently they believed the king was the preferable option. And so because king is seen as a preferable option, becoming more popular, religious radicals, political radicals, lots of unrest, the king is seen as stability. Whee! Do you want that again?
Yeah.
I like it. So, they tell the king to present himself as a symbol of order and stability. Actually, he doesn't really do a very good job of that. Pym, of course, is pushing for more changes. He's alarmed that there's growing support for the king. So what does Pym publish? The Grand Remonstrance. This big list of complaints. So the start of the second session of the Long Parliament, because of growing popularity of the king, Pym publishes the Grand Remonstrance. There's Catholics everywhere. So, its main reason, the breakup, it reminded people of what Charles had done since the start of the personal rule. It said there was a Roman Catholic conspiracy, and it was designed to justify Pym's demands. It was divided. There were drawn swords in the House of the Commons, but they said, look, the king is trying to become a dictator. There is a Roman Catholic conspiracy. We need to keep pushing on the reforms. 159 to 148 votes. So really, when we're talking about the Civil War, we're talking about being king versus parliament. We're not really. This was the line in the sand. 159 who were against the king, 148 who were these constitutional royalists. What did it say? So it started, this Grand Remonstrance, lists all the policies and actions of Charles since 1629. It made demands of the king justified by his track record. Parliament should choose the king's ministers. Parliament should be able to remove ministers. There should be a conference of religious ministers, and there was a Roman Catholic conspiracy, and the House of Commons should find and punish the people involved. This caused the growing of the King's Party in the House of Commons, prepared to defend the king. They were really concerned about how Pym and his control of the mob, and actually it was often seen as the straw which broke the camel's back. It was published. Pym is seen as undermining the social order. Some MPs greatly disturbed by the public disorder, preaching pamphlets, writing. The England is seen as almost slipping into anarchy at this point. Consequently, because of the Grand Remonstrance, it almost makes civil war seem less likely because more people grew to support the king. You with me? So what is it that kind of suddenly starts the ball rolling again and descending into civil war? The Irish Rebellion. Remember much about the Irish Rebellion? After the execution of Strafford, the Irish are no longer under his policy of thorough, his oppressive rule, his iron fist. 1st of November, a rebellion starts, 1641. Native Catholic Irish, they start rebelling against the Protestants. 4,000 Protestants are killed, 8,000 fled. The rumours spread to England, wildly exaggerated, 250,000 killed, supposedly. But worse still, the rebels claimed they were acting in the name of the king. The king needs an army to stop the rebels, so he goes to Parliament, but the king makes a big error. What does he not do? He refuses to name his commander. The rebellion believed in a Roman Catholic conspiracy. Give me an army. And then Charles makes some bizarre error or bizarre judgment. Right in the middle of the Roman Catholic conspiracy, he puts a man, he turns to the courts of device. He puts a guy called Thomas Lunsford in charge of the Tower of London. Thomas Lunsford was a mercenary. Was this the king starting to put into place people to do a military takeover, do a military coup d'etat? Parliament are up in arms about Thomas Lunsford going in. They say, you cannot do this. It was seen as a secret desire to gain freedom. Charles therefore reversed. He fired Thomas Lunsford. Was he really therefore considering a coup d'etat? No. And it also meant that the king could be forced to be back. Charles therefore failed to nominate a commander of his army to go and fight the Irish. Who did Parliament want? Do you know? They wanted the Earl of Essex to be their commander. So, Irish Rebellion stokes up fear of a Roman Catholic conspiracy. The Grand Remonstrance has said that the Parliament should go and investigate a Roman Catholic conspiracy. So, who could possibly be the leader of a Roman Catholic conspiracy in England? Henrietta Maria. And so rumours start spreading that Parliament are going to impeach the Queen. Charles believes that Pym is plotting to impeach the Queen, so Charles decides instead to take the first measure. He will impeach Lord Mandeville and 5 members of Parliament: Pym, Hollis, Hasselridge, Stroge, Hampden. The impeachment is not acted upon. What are we coming to?
When it goes into the House of Commons, they go down the river.
Thank you very much. 5 members coup. Charles' solution was to initiate a military coup. On the 6th of January 1642, not 5th, he entered the House of Commons with 300 troops. But of course, they've been given a tip-off. They escaped down the river, and there's this kind of comedy chasing through the streets, apparently. House of Commons is outraged, makes civil war much more likely. MPs, suddenly the kind of the King's party starts to crumble and collapse. The King leaves for Oxford University, where he goes and spends the next few months. Whoops, run away! Off he goes. So the king has now left London for the last time until he's brought back again at the end of the First Civil War. Charles leaves London. Henrietta Maria goes to France to try and get support. Fails. Charles tries to get out of control. His troops try and get control of royal arsenals around the country. Mostly they're successful, but of course in Hull and Portsmouth they failed. And this whole time, it's what's we call, over the next few months, it's known as the Paper War. Both sides try and generate support using lots of propaganda. Charles swings between compromise and war, but Henrietta says, do not compromise. And this chap, Harpurhall Grimston again, says, we sink unsensibly into the state of civil war. So, the drift to civil war. Unrest widening social divide. The gentry are rearming. The gentry, warned by the unrest and power vacuum, they started to defend themselves. A paper war started off. Parliament and the king, between Parliament and the king, most people wanted to stay neutral, of course, at the start of the Civil War. Support your king. Moving on. Both sides, of course, try and generate support using their paper war. They also try and generate support. They want to get men for their army. Can you remember the name of the document that Parliament published to try and get troops? Militia Ordnance. Mail ish or in ants. The Militia Ordnance, to try and get that. Parliament do it first. Then the king, of course, does his Commission of Array. Thank you very much. March 1642, both sides wanted an army. The Militia Ordnance had to be approved by the king. It wasn't, so it could be ignored. The Commission of Array was used by the king in June. It was even more dubious. It was ignored. And then Parliament publish their final set of pre-war negotiations called the 19 Propositions. Can you remember some of the key points of them?
He chooses who his son would marry.
Yeah. The king would give up his control of the armed forces, give up his control of the church. Parliament would be able to choose the king's ministers, and controversially, Parliament should appoint guardians for the king's children and even have the right to approve who they marry. Put forward by the king. Anyway, it doesn't really matter because the king rejects them. Parliament creates a committee of public safety. They put the Earl of Essex in charge of 24,000 men. The king, on the other hand, has only got 800 supporters. Moving on. Parliament tries to take control of the Manchester Arsenal. It's the first time gunshots are fired. I don't think anyone's killed, but they fire gunshots. Lord Strange forcibly tries to stop them, but it's the first actual fighting. As a result of this, on the 22nd of August 1642, whilst in Nottingham, the king declares war, and therefore it's the war. Parliament miscalculates right from the start. 6th of September, Parliament says that anyone who's not for them was a delinquent and therefore should pay the cost of the war. Consequently, the gentry would their option of being neutral was taken away from them. They would have to pay for one or the other. Men in neutral entry therefore came out to support the king, and consequently the king's 800 men grew to an army of tens of thousands. And the civil war was to drag on. And of course, that is key question 1. Why, within 2 years of the collapse of personal rule, did civil war break out? Any questions?